He was just a drifter riding across the blistering prairie with nothing but dust in his lungs and emptiness in his heart. Then he heard it, a sound that stopped him cold. A baby crying, out here, in the middle of nowhere. Jack followed that sound and found them in a dip in the dry earth. A woman, barely alive, her body covered in bruises, and a 4-month-old baby girl screaming with everything she had left. The woman had walked 15 miles across that burning prairie. 15 miles with a newborn in her arms, running from a husband so cruel he had thrown their baby against a wall. Now that husband was coming. He was rich, he was powerful, he had lawyers and hired guns, and he would stop at nothing to drag them back. Jack had spent 34 years running from everything. But when that tiny baby grabbed his thumb and held on like he mattered, he made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. What happens when a man with nothing decides to fight a monster who has everything? The lesson. The bravest thing you can do is simply stop and care. One choice to help, one moment of mercy can echo through generations and change the world. Home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to fight for. If you believe that one person's courage can make all the difference, drop a comment below, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Because stories like this remind us that heroes aren't born. They're made in the moment they decide to stop running. Jack was a drifter, 34 years old, with a face carved by the sun and eyes that had seen too much. He was headed to a little town called Willow Creek, trying to collect some pay he was owed, when that tiny sound cut right through the blistering heat. For a second, he sat dead still on his horse, Scout, just listening. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, and the sun just hammered down. He almost talked himself into believing he'd imagined it. Then it came again. Weaker this time, a sound that tore right through him. Jack nudged Scout and rode toward it. There, in a dip in the dry earth, was a woman. She was young, maybe 25, with her dark hair matted and her face as pale as a Sunday plate. Her dress was torn and stained, and beside her, wrapped in what was left of a fancy gown, was the source of that cry. The baby was wailing with all its might. Jack slid off his horse, his boots sinking into the dust. He moved in slow, like he was approaching a spooked deer. The woman didn't move an inch. He knelt down and felt for a pulse. It was there, faint and fluttery. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from not using it for 4 days. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. The baby's cries got louder, and Jack turned to the little one. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old, her face all red and purple from screaming. He picked her up and she weighed next to nothing. He could feel her. He looked at the baby bundled against him, then to the woman near death in the dust. Willow Creek was a long ride from here, a promise that felt mighty thin. Damn it all. He moved like a man who'd spent 20 years turning bad situations right. He took his last bit of water and soaked his spare shirt, laying the cool cloth over the woman's face to fight the fever. Then he pulled the saddle blanket off Scout and spread it out. He lifted the woman, light as a bundle of dry sticks, and laid her down on it. The baby fussed, looking for a meal he couldn't give her. "I know, little one," he whispered. "Just hang on." He rigged a sling from his rope, a cradle of sorts to hold the woman against his chest as he rode. It wouldn't be comfortable, but speed was all that mattered now. He got on Scout, settling the woman's limp body against him and tucking the baby safe between them. The whole setup was clumsy, but it had to do. "Southeast," he told the horse. "As fast as you can go without breaking our necks." Scout's ears twitched. That gelding had been his only partner for 6 years, seeing him through blizzards and dry spells. If any horse could make it, Scout could. They took off at a pace that rattled his bones but ate up the miles. The sun was merciless. Sweat poured down Jack's back, soaking into the woman's dress. He could feel her heartbeat, fast and weak like a trapped bird's. The baby cried for a mile or so, then went quiet, a stillness that scared him. He pressed a hand to her back, feeling for breath. She was still fighting. "Stay with me," he urged the woman, knowing she couldn't hear. Your little girl needs you. Whatever you ran from, you have to fight." Her head rolled against his shoulder. Now that she was close, he could see the ugly bruises on her arms, old and new. The blood on her dress wasn't from childbirth. Someone had hurt her bad, and she had run for her life. Jack's jaw went tight. He'd seen his share of evil, but this was different. This was a mother and her child left to die in the sun because some man decided they weren't worth a damn. "You're gonna make it," he told them, trying to believe it himself. The miles dragged on. Scout started breathing hard, so Jack slowed him to a trot. But then the baby's breathing got shallow, and he had to push the horse back into a run. Every choice was a gamble. As the sun began to set, he spotted smoke rising in the distance. Then he saw the buildings of Willow Creek, a dozen wood shacks on a dirt road with a church steeple pointing to the sky. "Almost there," he said to Scout, his voice raw. He galloped right down the main street, sending chickens and dogs scattering. Folks stopped and stared at the sight of him. "Doctor!" Jack yelled, his voice cracking. "I need a doctor!" A man in a leather apron came out of the blacksmith shop. "What's wrong?" he asked, his face full of suspicion. "Found them out on the plains. The woman's got a fever. The baby's starving. Where's the doctor?" "End of the street. The white house with green shutters," the blacksmith said, his tone changing from wary to worried. Jack spurred Scout the last few yards, pulling up hard in front of the house. An older man with silver hair walked out. He had the calm eyes of someone who knew death well. "I'm Dr. Hennessy." The doctor took in the scene. The woman passed out, the silent baby, and Jack's sunburnt chest. "Bring them in, now." Jack slid from the saddle, his legs shaky. He carried the woman inside to a clean room that smelled of medicine. The doctor pointed to a small bed. "Lay her there. Is the child hurt?" "I don't think so. Just hungry. They've been out there a while." Jack gently handed the baby to the doctor. The little girl's silence was a heavy weight. For a second, Jack feared the worst. Then she let out a small, wet cough, and her dark blue eyes opened. "She's dehydrated," Dr. Hennessy said, "but she's a fighter." He called to the back of the house. "Sarah, I need your help." A woman with flour on her apron appeared. The doctor's wife, Jack, figured. "Oh, good heavens," she whispered. "What happened?" "Found them on the prairie," Jack said again. The long ride was catching up to him, and he started to shake. "About 15 miles northwest. She was out cold." "You did the right thing," the doctor said, handing the baby to his wife. "Sarah, warm up some goat's milk. Just a little at a time with the eyedropper." He turned back to the woman on the bed, checking her pulse and looking in her eyes. "Help me get this dress off. I need to check for internal bleeding." Jack paused for a moment. The doctor looked up at him. "Son, I'm a doctor. Modesty won't save her life. Now help me." They carefully removed the ruined dress. The clothes underneath were stained and her body was covered in bruises. It told a story of terrible violence. "Someone did this to her," Dr. Hennessy said. "It wasn't a question. Some of it's fresh. Those bruises on her face look about 3 or 4 days old." The doctor's jaw was tight as he checked for broken bones. When he pulled back her undergarment to check her ribs, Jack saw a bruise in the shape of a boot and had to turn away. "That bastard," he growled. "Watch your language," the doctor said, but without any real heat. "Though I can't say I disagree." He covered her up again. "She's badly dehydrated and that fever is high. But I don't think anything is broken. If we can get some fluids in her, she has a chance. The baby, too. They're both tough." Jack finally let himself sag. Jack leaned hard against the wall, feeling like he'd been rode hard and put away wet. His legs were shaking, and his chest felt tight as a drum. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath for what felt like hours. "You ought to sit down before you fall down," Dr. Hennessy said, his voice firm but not mean. Jack wanted to say he was fine, but the doctor saw right through it. "You're sunburnt, got no water in you, and you're in shock. When was the last time you ate?" Jack couldn't rightly remember. Time had turned into a blur out on that big, empty flatland. The doctor pointed a thumb toward a chair. "Sit. We'll get you food and water. You're no good to anyone collapsed on my floor." Jack's body gave out before his pride did, and he slumped into the chair. Dr. Hennessy handed him a cool glass of water, and it felt like a miracle going down his parched throat. "Don't thank me yet," the doctor said, turning back to the woman on the bed. He gently washed her face, trying to fight the fever. "Do you know her name?" "No, sir. Found 'em just like this. No wagon, no papers. Just them and the clothes on their backs." The doctor's hands never stopped their work. "Someone's going to come looking for her," he said quietly. Jack nodded grimly. "I reckon so, but judging by those bruises, whoever it is might not be wishing her well." Their eyes met over the poor woman, and a quiet understanding passed between them. No matter who came knocking, they'd handle it. But first, they had a life to save. Just then, Sarah, the doctor's wife, came in with the baby, who was making tiny sounds around a dropper. "She's taken the milk," Sarah said, relief washing over her face. "Slow, but it's a start." Dr. Hennessy motioned toward Jack. "Sarah, this fella is Jack Rowan. He's the one who brought them in. Could you find him some supper and a clean shirt? His is serving as a baby blanket right now." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I'll get one of my son's shirts. It should fit." She looked from the baby in her arms to the woman on the bed. "Do we have names for them?" "Not yet," the doctor replied. "Well," Sarah said, shifting the baby on her shoulder, "until we do, I suppose we'll just have to call them miracles, because that's what this is." "You finding them? Getting them here alive?" Jack looked at the woman, her face still pale as a ghost, her breathing shallow but steady. She was a fighter. Then he looked at the baby whose little hand was curled around Sarah's finger. "Maybe so," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe that's just what they are." All through the long night, Dr. Hennessy worked, changing cool cloths and checking on the woman. Sarah kept bringing Jack food he barely tasted and made sure the baby was fed. His eyes never left the woman on the bed. Sometime around midnight, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, filled with a deep confusion and fear. They took in the strange room, the lamplight, the unfamiliar faces. Then her gaze landed on Jack, and he could see her trying to figure out if he was a friend or a foe. "You're safe," Jack said, the words coming out before he even thought them. "You're in a town called Willow Creek. This is Dr. Hennessy's home. You've been mighty sick, but you're safe now." She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. The doctor was there in an instant, helping her take a few small sips of water. Some color came back to her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was just a rough whisper. "My baby?" Sarah stepped right into her line of sight, cradling the infant. "She's right here, fed and warm and fast asleep, see?" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the baby's head. The relief on her face was a powerful thing to see. "Thank you," she whispered. "Can you tell us your name?" Dr. Hennessy asked gently. The woman's eyes darted between the three of them. A guarded look came over her face like a wall going up. "Elena," she said, her voice a little stronger but cautious. "My name is Elena Marsh, and my daughter is Mia." The doctor nodded. "Elena, I need to ask you some questions. How did you end up out on the prairie?" There was a long pause. Jack could practically see her weighing what to say. "I was walking," she finally said. "From where?" Elena looked him straight in the eye. "From hell," she said, and the way she said it, you knew she meant every word. "I was walking from hell, and I didn't think I'd get out alive." The room went quiet, save for the baby's soft breathing. "Well," the doctor said after a moment, "you made it, and we're going to help you get your strength back." "Why?" The question was sharp, full of suspicion. "You don't know me." Don't have to, Jack said, surprising himself. He met Elena's gaze. Out here, folks help other folks who need it. It's as simple as that. And if someone comes looking for me? The question hung heavy in the air. Jack felt something settle deep in his gut. Then I reckon they'll have to get through us first. Elena stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any hint of a lie. She must have found what she was looking for because she closed her eyes and let her head sink back into the pillow. My husband, she whispered. His name is Robert Marsh. If he comes here, you have to promise me. Don't let him take Mia. No matter what he says, don't let him take my little girl. The raw desperation in her voice made the hair on Jack's arm stand up. He looked at that tiny, peaceful baby, then back at the bruised woman on the bed, and a decision was made for him. I promise, he said, and he meant it. He won't lay a hand on her. Elena's eyes opened one last time, and then she finally drifted off to sleep. The doctor motioned for Jack to follow him out of the room. You shouldn't make promises you can't keep, son, he said quietly. I aim to keep it. A husband has legal rights, the doctor warned. If Robert Marsh shows up with papers, there's not much the law will let us do. Then the law is wrong, Jack said flatly. Dr. Hennessy gave a tired smile. This is rough country, Mr. Rowan. Good intentions can get a man buried out here. He put a hand on Jack's shoulder. But I respect a man who stands by his word. If he shows up, my wife and I will stand with you. We don't hold with men who treat their family that way, law or no law. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Get some sleep. But Jack knew he wouldn't be sleeping. He went back to his chair and watched over Elena and Mia as the prairie wind howled outside. He'd made a promise. Now he just had to figure out how to keep it. Just as the first light of dawn touched the sky, Elena's fever broke. The baby started to stir, and Sarah got a bottle ready. Jack stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. Dr. Hennessy appeared with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Jack. She's going to live, the doctor said. They both are, thanks to you. I just brought them here. You did a hell of a lot more than that. You gave them a chance. The doctor took a sip of his coffee. So, what are your plans now, Mr. Rowan? I take it you were just passing through. Jack had been wondering that all night himself. He'd come to Willow Creek to pick up his pay and move on, just like he always did, never staying put, never letting anyone get close. But something had changed. Something had shifted out on that wide-open prairie. Maybe it was the tiny weight of that baby girl on his chest or the look in Elena's eyes when he swore he'd protect her child. Or maybe after 20 years of running, he was just plain tired. I'm staying, he said, the words surprising even him. Long enough to see him through. Jack glanced at Elena, sleeping soundly for what must have been the first time in weeks. He looked at the baby, safe in Sarah's arms, and this little life he'd stumbled into saving. He just couldn't make himself walk away. I gave my word, and I aim to keep it. Dr. Hennessy just nodded, a small smile forming. Well, then, I reckon we ought to get ready for what's coming. The prairie wind outside seemed to agree, carrying the far-off sound of horses in trouble. Jack set his coffee down and moved to the window. His hand found the worn grip of the Colt at his side. Whatever it was, he'd be ready. He'd made a promise. But the hoofbeats Jack heard weren't Robert Marsh's, not yet. They were just some ranch hands from the Circle K. But Jack's hand stayed on his pistol long after they'd passed. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Elena slept right through the morning, her body finally getting the rest it was crying for. Little Mia woke up every few hours, hungry and getting louder about it. Sarah Hennessy moved around that house like a woman who'd raised 4 of her own. She taught Jack how to hold the baby, how to support her little head, and how to test the milk on his wrist. You're a natural at this, Sarah told him. She watched him feed Mia with a little glass dropper, his big calloused hands moving so gently. He didn't know about that. But he didn't move when Mia's tiny fingers clamped around his thumb with a surprising strength. "Babies know," Sarah said softly. "They can tell who's safe. She trusts you." Jack looked down at the infant. Her dark blue eyes stared back at him with a kind of knowing he couldn't explain. He'd never given children a lick of thought. They meant roots and responsibility, two things he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But holding Mia, feeling her complete trust in him, something inside his chest cracked open. Dr. Hennessy showed up in the doorway, holding his medical bag. "I've got to make my rounds. Old Mrs. Patterson's joints are aching, and the Miller boy broke his arm." He looked square at Jack. "You'll stay with them?" "I will." "Good. Don't let her out of that bed no matter what she says. Her body needs to mend." He lowered his voice. "And if anyone comes asking about strangers, you don't know a thing. You understand?" Jack just nodded. The doctor left, and Sarah went to the kitchen to fix some broth. Jack sat in a chair by the bed with Mia asleep on his chest. And he waited. Elena woke up around noon, her eyes looking clearer. She took in the room, her gaze landing on Jack and the baby in his arms. A storm of feelings crossed her face. Relief, fear, and gratitude all mixed together. "She's eaten," Jack said quietly. "Getting stronger." "Thank you," Elena whispered, her voice still shaky. "I don't even know your name." "Jack Rowan." She tried to sit up but let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her side. "Easy now," Jack said, getting to his feet while holding Mia steady. "Doctor said you need to rest." "I've rested enough." But she stayed put, her face pale from the pain. "How long have I been here?" "About 18 hours. I found you out on the prairie yesterday." Elena's eyes searched his face. "Why?" The question threw him. "Why what? Why did you help us? Men don't—" She looked away, unable to finish. "Men don't help without wanting something." Jack heard a long, painful history in those few words. He chose his own words with care. "I heard your baby crying, that's all. I heard her and couldn't just ride on by." "Most men would have." "Maybe so. But I'm not most men." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod like he'd passed some kind of test. Sarah came in with the broth, and they talked about practical things. Jack slipped out to the porch to give them some room and clear his head. The town was alive under the afternoon sun. Wagons kicked up dust on the main street. Women carried parasols, and children chased a dog between the buildings, their laughter filling the air. It all looked so peaceful and ordinary. But Jack knew better. He knew peace was something you had to fight to keep. He was rolling a smoke when a man in his mid-40s with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest walked up. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Afternoon. You must be Jack Rowan." Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he stopped himself. The sheriff saw it, but didn't make a move. "That's me. Name's Tom Brennan. I'm the law here in Willow Creek." He gestured toward the house. "Doc Hennessy said you brought in a woman and a child yesterday. Found 'em on the prairie. Mind telling me where?" Jack described the spot, about 15 miles out. A long walk for a woman with a newborn. "Did she say where she came from?" "Haven't asked." Brennan raised an eyebrow. "You haven't asked, or she hasn't told you?" "A little of both." The sheriff was quiet for a second, sizing Jack up the same way Elena had. "You planning on staying in town, Mr. Rowan?" "For now." "And your business here?" "Just making sure that woman and her baby are all right." "That's mighty noble of you." Brennan's voice was flat, just stating a fact. "But around here, nobility can get you killed. A woman running from something means her trouble follows close behind. I can handle my own trouble. I don't doubt it, son. I'm just saying, helping folks can pull you into fights that ain't yours." Brennan shifted his stance, his hand resting near his pistol out of pure habit. "I've been sheriff here for 12 years. I've seen plenty of women running from bad men and good men who thought they could save 'em. It almost never ends well. Sounds like you're telling me to walk away. I'm telling you to be careful, and if trouble is headed this way, I expect to know about it first. Willow Creek is a peaceful town, and I aim to keep it that way. Jack held the sheriff's gaze. If trouble comes, you'll be the first to know. Appreciate it. Brennan tipped his hat. Welcome to Willow Creek, Mr. Rowan. He turned and walked off, dust puffing up from his boots. Jack watched him go, then lit his cigarette. The sheriff was right. This wasn't his fight. The smart move was to get his pay, see that Elena was safe, and ride out before Robert Marsh arrived. But he never was one for the smart move. Inside, Elena was sitting up, feeding Mia a bottle. The sight of them, a mother and her child, stopped him. It was the most natural thing in the world, except for the dark bruises on her skin and the deep exhaustion in her eyes. The sheriff stopped by, Jack said. Her head shot up, her face flooded with fear. What did he want? Just told him I found you out on the prairie. Nothing more. Did he ask about Robert? He didn't mention a name. Just asked if trouble was coming to his town. Elena looked down at Mia, her hand shaking. It is. He'll come for us. I just don't know when. Tell me about him. Why? So you can judge me for marrying him? For staying so long? So I know what I'm up against when he gets here. That word, we, hung between them. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she fought them back. You don't owe me a thing, Mr. Rowan. You saved our lives. That's more than enough. You ought to leave before he finds you. Not planning on it. Why not? Her voice was sharp with disbelief. You don't know me. I know you walked 15 miles across an open prairie with a baby just to get away from him. I know you collapsed from heat and thirst, but somehow kept your daughter alive through it all. I know you're the toughest woman I've ever met, and I'm not about to leave you to face him by yourself. Elena just stared, the tears finally falling. He will kill you. If you stand between him and what he considers his property, he will kill you without a second thought. He can try. This isn't a game, Mr. Rowan. Robert isn't like other men. He's rich, educated, and has powerful friends. He uses lawyers and money to get whatever he wants, and he'll destroy anyone who gets in his way. Jack pulled a chair closer to her bed. Then you'd better tell me everything. If I'm going to fight the man, I need to know who I'm fighting. Elena was quiet for a long time, rubbing slow circles on Mia's back. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, like she was telling someone else's story. I met Robert in St. Louis 3 years ago. I was a seamstress. He walked into the shop where I worked, all handsome and charming. He quoted poetry and brought me flowers. She gave a bitter little laugh. I thought I was the luckiest girl alive when he asked to marry me. What happened? Nothing happened. That was always who he was. I just couldn't see it until we were married. The charm was just a tool he used to get what he wanted. And he wanted something he could own and control. She shifted Mia to her shoulder, patting her back. The first time he hit me was 2 weeks after our wedding. I disagreed with him about something small. He cried afterward and swore it would never happen again. So I forgave him. And it kept happening. Each time, he would apologize, and I would forgive him. I had nowhere else to go. I had no family, no money of my own. He was careful, too. The bruises were always hidden under my clothes. To the world, we looked like the perfect couple. Jack's jaw clenched, but he let her continue. When I found out I was having Mia, I hoped a child would soften him. It only made things worse. He wanted a son, not a daughter. When Mia was born, he looked at her like she was my failure. Her voice cracked. The beatings got more frequent, more vicious. I started putting aside money, planning to run. I finally got my chance 2 weeks ago. What made you run then? Her face turned to stone. He came home drunk. A business deal had gone bad, and he blamed me for it. He said I'd embarrassed him and made him look weak. He beat me worse than ever before. When Mia started crying, She stopped, her body trembling. Jack waited, his hands balled into fists. He picked her up, my 4-month-old baby, and he threw her across the room like she was nothing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She hit the wall. I thought she was dead, but then she cried, and I knew if I didn't get her out of there that night, he would kill her eventually. So I waited for him to pass out, took my money, and I ran. And you ended up on the prairie. I made it to a town called Diedridge, about 20 miles east. I was trying to buy a stagecoach ticket, but someone recognized me from a notice Robert had put out. The man sent a telegram. Robert showed up with 3 of his hired men. I barely escaped out a back window and just ran into the open country until I couldn't run anymore. Jack paced to the window, a cold rage building inside him. He'd killed men in the war and in saloon fights, but he'd never felt a need to kill a man like he did Robert Marsh. Where is he now? I don't know. But he won't give up. It's about his pride now. And when he finds you with me, he'll have to go through me first. You say that like it's supposed to mean something. Like one man can actually stop him. Jack turned from the window, and the look on his face made her stop breathing. I'm not just any man, ma'am. I'm a man who's decided you and your little girl are worth protecting. And men like your husband have underestimated me my whole life. It never ends well for them. A knock on the door made them both jump. Sarah poked her head in, looking worried. Jack, there's a man out front. He's asking about a missing woman and child. Says he's been tracking his wife across the territory. Elena's face went pale. Oh, God, he's here. Stay put. Jack's voice was low and calm. He looked at Sarah. Keep them in here and lock this door. Don't open it for anyone but me or the doc. What are you going to do? I'm going to have a little talk. Jack walked through the house, his anger now cold and sharp. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The man in the street was just as he'd imagined. Mid-30s, dressed in a fine suit that didn't belong in the dusty street. His face was handsome, the kind that fooled women who didn't know any better. 2 hard-looking men with guns stood with him. Good afternoon, the man said, his voice smooth as silk. I'm looking for Dr. Hennessy. I was told he treated a woman and a baby who came in yesterday. The doctor is out on his rounds. He won't be back until this evening. I see. And who might you be? Nobody that concerns you. The man's smile stayed, but his eyes went cold. I am Robert Marsh. I'm searching for my wife, Elena, and our daughter. I have reason to believe they came through this town. Have you seen them? Jack leaned against a porch post, his hand resting near his gun. And what makes you think they'd be here? A man in Diedridge saw a woman matching her description heading west with a baby. This is the only town in that direction. It's simple logic. His tone was patient, like he was explaining something to a child. My wife has been unwell, you see. Mentally. She ran off without her medicine. I'm terribly worried about her. I am terribly worried about her and the child. Elena has always been a delicate thing. The birth was hard on her, and she just hasn't been herself. I've been looking for them for nearly 2 weeks. Jack saw right through the performance. The concerned husband making sure any witnesses would see him as the poor victim. It was a well-rehearsed act. If I see a woman and baby, I'll tell the sheriff, Jack said. I'd appreciate you telling me directly. I'm at the hotel. Robert offered a card. When Jack didn't take it, he set it on the porch rail. There's a substantial reward, $500. That's generous. My family means everything to me, Mr. Rowan. I just want them home. I'm sure you do. Something in Jack's voice made Robert's eyes narrow and the friendly mask slipped. You sound like you doubt my concern. Maybe I do. If you know where my wife is and you're keeping it from me, that's a crime. Interfere with a husband's legal rights is a serious offense. So is beating a woman and throwing a newborn against a wall. The words hung heavy in the air. Robert's face went cold and still. His 2 hired guns shifted, their hands drifting toward their pistols. That is quite a serious accusation, Robert said, his voice dangerously low. Do you have any proof? I don't need proof to see the kind of man you are. And what kind is that? The kind that hides behind his money and his lawyers. The kind that thinks a piece of paper gives him the right to own another person. The kind that beats a woman and calls it discipline. Robert's false smile vanished. You are making a big mistake, Mr. Rowan. It wouldn't be my first. I have powerful friends. I have lawyers. If you are hiding my wife, I will see you thrown in jail. You're welcome to try. This isn't a game. Elena is my wife. That child is my daughter. You have no right to keep them from me. Funny thing about rights, Jack said calmly. Sometimes the law runs up against what's decent, and the law don't always win. Robert stepped closer. I will get them back one way or another, and anyone who stands in my way is going to regret it. Are we clear? Are you done talking? For a second, Jack thought Robert might be foolish enough to try something right then and there. Of his men might draw on him right then and there. But Robert was smarter than that. We'll talk later, Robert said, then turned and walked to the hotel with his men. He stopped halfway there and looked back. By the way, Mr. Rowan, I know who you are. Jack Rowan. Kicked out of the 5th Colorado Cavalry. Wanted in 2 territories for assault. You're in no position to be judging anyone. Jack stood his ground. Takes one to know one. Robert gave a cold smile. Indeed. Enjoy your time in town, Mr. Rowan. It's going to be short. Jack watched them leave, his heart pounding. When they were gone, he went inside. Sarah was standing there, looking pale. He's going to cause trouble, she said. He already has, Jack replied. What are we going to do? Fight him. But I need to talk to your husband and the sheriff first. Elena appeared in the bedroom doorway, holding Mia tight. Her face was white with fear. You shouldn't have stood up to him like that, she said. Now he knows you're here to help me, protecting us. He'll come for you. Let him, Jack. She caught herself, seeming to realize she'd used his first name. Mr. Rowan. Please just tell him where I am. I can't have your death on my soul, too. Jack crossed the room in 3 long steps. He stood so close she had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. Now you listen to me. I meant every word I said. He's not taken you. And he's not taken Mia. I don't give a lick what the law says or what friends he's got, you understand? Tears streamed down Elena's face. Why? Why would you do this for us? Because someone should have done it a long, long time ago, because you and that baby deserve better. He softened his voice. And because I heard her crying out on that prairie, when I picked her up, she grabbed my thumb and held on like I mattered. Nobody's done that in 20 years, Mrs. Marsh. Elena choked back a sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. She just nodded, unable to find her words. Get some rest, Jack said. Tomorrow we'll figure out a plan. He walked to the door. I'm going to find the sheriff and the doc. Don't you open this door for anyone but us. He stepped out into the sun, feeling the full weight of his promise settle on him. Robert Marsh was no simple outlaw. He was smart, connected, and dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with a gun. Beating him would take more than grit. It would take a whole lot of planning. Jack found Sheriff Brennan at the jailhouse with his feet on the desk, reading a 3-day-old newspaper. The sheriff looked up as if he'd been expecting him. Well, that was fast, Brennan said, folding the paper. The man's been in town less than 2 hours and you're already here. Robert Marsh is in town. He came looking for his wife. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd let you know if I saw anything. Brennan's mouth twitched into a small smile. Mighty diplomatic of you. What's his story? He says his wife is unwell, ran off without her medicine, and he's just a worried husband trying to bring her home. You buying it? About as much as I'd trust a rattlesnake asking to share my bedroll for warmth. Brennan just watched Jack, his eyes sizing him up. You gonna tell me what you know that I don't? Jack took a breath, trusting this lawman was a huge gamble. But going up against Robert Marsh by himself was a fool's errand. Elena Marsh told me her husband put his hands on her, regular-like. 2 weeks ago, he threw their 4-month-old baby girl into a wall. That's why she took off. She was running for her life. And for her daughters. Brennan's face stayed like stone, but a cold hardness crept into his eyes. She'll say that in court if she has to. You saw the marks on her, didn't you? Enough to know it's the God's honest truth. Doc Hennessy saw 'em, too. The sheriff pushed himself up and walked to the window. He stared out at the long afternoon shadows stretching across the street. Here's the rub, Rowan. Even if it's all true, the law doesn't much care what goes on behind a man's front door. In the eyes of the court, she and the child belong to him. That ain't right. Nope, it sure ain't. Nope. But my job is to enforce the law, not change it. Jack felt a slow anger simmering inside him. So you're telling me you can't do a damn thing? I'm telling you I can't do much officially. If Marsh shows up with papers from a judge, I've got to hand them over. It's the job. Brennan turned back from the window, his face grim. Unofficially, I've put 2 women in the ground in this county because of their husband's discipline. So if Elena Marsh says she's in danger, I believe her. But what I believe doesn't change a lick of the law. Then what good are you? The words shot out, sharper than Jack meant. Brennan just gave a humorless smile. The good I am is this: I enforce the law square. That means if Robert Marsh puts one toe out of line, I'll come down on him with both boots. And it also means if you do something that ain't strictly legal but serves real justice, well, I might be slow on the uptake. You understand me? Jack understood perfectly. The sheriff was giving him room to work, so long as he didn't make him choose his badge over his conscience. I understand. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Marsh claims he has friends in high places. He could have a court order here in a few days. Then my hands are tied. Brennan paused. Unless we find another legal way around it. Like what? Well, the sheriff leaned on his desk. A husband has a claim on his wife and child. But that claim disappears if she's not his wife anymore. Divorce. It's rare, but it happens. Takes too much time and money, though. Time we don't have. So what are you getting at? Brennan looked Jack square in the eye. If Elena Marsh was married to another man, Robert Marsh's claim would be null and void. The thought hit Jack like a mule kick. You're saying I should marry her. I'm saying it's a choice. Might be the only legal one that'll protect her. Brennan held up a hand. I know it sounds crazy. You hardly know the woman, but if that court order shows up, this is likely the only play we have. Jack's head was spinning. Marriage meant settling down, putting down roots, everything he had spent his life running from. But it also meant a shield for Elena and Mia. A legal wall Marsh couldn't just knock down. How would that even work? Jack asked. She's already married. True. But if she testifies that she was forced into it, or that it was never a real marriage, a circuit judge might just annul it. Then she'd be free. Brennan shrugged. It ain't perfect. And a slick lawyer could fight it, but it would buy you time. It'd make Marsh's case a whole lot weaker. You know a judge who would do it? Judge Catherine Miller rides this circuit. She's due in Willow Creek in 3 days for court. And just between us, she's got no patience for men who hurt women. If Elena tells her story, the judge might just grant an emergency annulment. Jack walked to the window. 3 days. That was all they had. I need to think on this, Jack said. Don't think for too long. Marsh ain't going to be sitting on his hands. When Jack got back to the doctor's house, the sun was setting, painting the sky fiery red and orange. Sarah met him on the porch, her face etched with worry. Elena's been asking for you. He found her in the bedroom, sitting up with little Mia asleep in her arms. She looked a bit stronger, but her eyes were still full of fear. He's still in town, isn't he? She whispered. Down at the hotel, plotting his next move. Did you see the sheriff? Jack pulled a chair over, trying to find the words. I did. He wants to help, but the law ties his hands. Robert always gets what he wants, maybe not this time. Jack leaned in. The sheriff had an idea. A way to protect you that Marsh can't get around legally. What is it? Jack took a steadying breath. Marriage. If you were married to someone else, Robert's claim on you would be gone. Elena just stared at him. Married to who? To me. The room went dead silent. Outside, the world went on, but in here, time stood still. That's crazy, she finally said. Probably is. We're strangers. Marriage is supposed to be forever, not a legal trick. It would be a marriage in name only, he explained, just on paper to keep you safe until Robert gives up and goes home. Then we could have it undone. He met her gaze. It would be nothing more than a strategy. I swore I would never let another man have that kind of power over me. I wouldn't have any power, Jack said, trying to find the right words. It would all be your choice, Elena. Where you go, what you do. I'd just be a name on a paper that stands between you and him. Why would you do that? Marry a woman you don't know? For a child that isn't yours? She had asked him before. Why was he risking his neck for strangers? I told you, he said simply. I heard your baby crying and I couldn't just ride on by. This is the same thing. I see something that's wrong and I can't just turn my back. That's no reason to marry someone. No, it's not. But it's a good reason to help. Look, the judge isn't coming for 3 days. You have time to think about it. But if Robert gets those papers first, our hands will be tied. Elena was quiet, her eyes distant. Jack could almost see the war going on inside her head. At last she looked right at him. If I did this, what would you want from me? Nothing. Everyone wants something. Robert made sure I learned that lesson. Then maybe I'm here to teach you a different one. Some folks help because it's the right thing to do. You're either a saint or a fool. Reckon I'm the fool, he said with a small smile. But I keep my promises. And I promise to keep you and Mia safe. She watched him for a long moment, then gave a slow, small nod. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. As he stood to go, her voice stopped him. Jack. Thank you. No matter what I decide, thank you. Get some rest. We'll figure it out. Outside, Dr. Hennessy was on the porch steps smoking his pipe. Sarah told me about the sheriff's plan, he said. You're really thinking about doing it. It might be the only way. Marriage is a heavy chain, Jack. Even one that's just for show. I know. Do you? The doctor asked, turning to face him. 'Cause you're a man who has run from being tied down his whole life. Now you're talking about taking on a wife and a child. That's no small thing. It ain't. Call it small. You called it necessary. Hennessy puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling into the twilight. I've only known you 2 days, but I can see the kind of man you are, Jack Rowan. You're a good man, whatever is in your past. But good intentions aren't always enough to see a thing through. What are you getting at? I'm saying that if you do this, Elena and that baby will be dependent on you. Not just for a little while, but maybe for years. You'll be a part of their lives. Are you ready for that? Jack had been wondering the same thing himself. He'd spent 20 years proving he was the last man anyone should ever rely on. How could he change all that now? But then he pictured Mia's little hand around his thumb. He saw the trust in Elena's eyes when he made his promise. I don't know if I'm ready, Jack admitted, but I'm willing to try. That's got to count for something. Hennessy nodded. It does. Just know, once you start down this road, there ain't no easy way back. You'll be part of their story, and they'll be part of yours. Make sure that's what you truly want. I will. The doctor stood and tapped his pipe against the rail. I'm going to check on my patients. You should get some food in you and try to rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Jack stayed on the porch as night fell over the town. Warm yellow light began to spill from windows. Down the street, a piano played a tune that sounded familiar. It all looked so peaceful. But Jack knew that peace was a fragile thing. He was still sitting there when he heard boots on the dirt path. Jack's hand went to his gun before he recognized Sheriff Brennan's outline in the dark. Figured I might find you here, Brennan said, coming up the steps. Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind. I reckon so. The sheriff leaned on the rail. I sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office about Robert Marsh. Got a reply about an hour ago. He's who he says he is. Rich family, powerful friends. Owns businesses all over. Also known for getting what he wants. Brennan paused. But here's where it gets real interesting. This ain't the first time his wife has run away. Jack's head shot up. What? 5 years ago, he was married to a woman named Catherine. She just disappeared one night. Vanished. Marsh claimed she ran off with another fellow, but her body was never found. No sign of her at all. Most folks figured she was dead one way or another. You think he killed her? Can't prove a thing, but it's mighty curious timing, don't you think? First wife goes missing, second wife runs for her life, all bruised up. A man starts to see a pattern, a cold dread settle deep in Jack's gut. Elena and Mia aren't safe, are they? Even if we win in court, he'll come for them. Men like Marsh always do, Brennan said, his voice grim. That's why I had to tell you. If you marry Elena, you're not just blocking a legal claim. You're stepping right in front of a man who might have already put one wife in the ground. You need to know exactly what you're getting into. I appreciate you telling me. It ain't a warning, it's a fact. And here's another one. If Marsh gets violent, I can lock him up. But if he's smart, he'll use the law against you. And once he gets what he wants... Brennan let the words hang in the air. Out here on the frontier, a rich man could get away with almost anything, even murder. And Robert Marsh figured his wife Elena was his to break. But he never counted on Jack Rowan. This is a story about how a good man, a brave woman, and a long-shot legal plan can stare down pure evil. It's about finding courage when you are terrified and finding family where you least expect it. So stick around to see how they turn the tables on a man who thought he owned the world. Brennan warned Jack, saying, "That man, Marsh, he'll fight this tooth and nail." Jack just nodded. Let him. Every day his lawyers waste in court is another day Elena and his little girl Mia are safe under my roof. The marriage is a shield. If Judge Miller grants the annulment and recognizes mine to Elena, Marsh loses all legal claim. Brennan grimaced. He's got hired muscle with him, two fellas out of Denver who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. They'll follow his orders as long as his money is green. Jack's jaw tightened. You think they'll make a move? If Marsh gets desperate enough, Brennan said, he will. A public humiliation like this. It makes men like him do violent, stupid things. After the sheriff left, Jack finally stepped inside. The plate of food Sarah saved for him was still warm, but he barely tasted it. His mind was a whirlwind, calculating the odds. He had just 3 days to keep them safe. 3 days to convince Elena that marrying him, a stranger, was her only way out. He was cleaning his plate when Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. She looked worn out, but resolute. "Can't sleep either?" Jack asked gently. Her voice was a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Robert. I see his hands. I feel him. I'm so afraid he's going to bust down that door and finish what he started." "He won't get through me," Jack promised. "But you can't stay awake forever," she reasoned. "I can for tonight," he said. She moved to the table and sat down, her hands trembling. "I've been thinking about what you offered, the marriage." Jack dried his hands and sat across from her. "I need to understand," she said, her eyes pleading. "If I do this, what would you expect from me?" "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said, but knew it wasn't enough of an answer. He tried again, speaking slow and clear. "Elena, this would be a legal paper between us, that is all. It's to keep you and Mia safe. I would not be your husband in the real sense. Your life would be your own. I'd protect Mia like she was my own blood, but you're her mother. You make the decisions." Tears welled in her eyes. "And when it's over? When he's gone for good and we can go our separate ways? Will you hate me? Will you feel like I used you?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know exactly what this is," Jack said. "It's a chance to keep a good woman and her child alive. For me, that is more than enough." She wiped her eyes. "You are a good man, Jack Rowan." She managed a weak smile. I want to do this. If the judge will have us, I want to try." Relief washed over Jack, mixed with the heavy weight of his promise. The next 2 days were thick with tension. Robert Marsh was a storm cloud hanging over the town. Jack saw him twice, once riding a fancy black horse with his goons, and another time just watching from the hotel porch like a hawk. Sheriff Brennan made sure his own presence was known, a quiet promise that the law was watching. Inside, they prepared for battle. The doctor tended to Elena's bruises, and Sarah altered a dress for her to wear in court. Jack stayed close, sleeping on the floor with his pistol nearby. He helped Elena rehearse her story, trying to prepare her for the questions that were coming. He even learned the quiet rhythm of rocking a baby to sleep, feeling the small weight of Mia in his arms. On the third morning, the stagecoach brought Judge Catherine Miller to Willow Creek. She was a woman of about 50 with gray hair and eyes that saw everything. Court was to begin at noon. Jack, Elena, and the sheriff were there first, but Robert Marsh was there too, sitting in the back with 2 slick lawyers from out of town. The whole room went quiet when Judge Miller called Elena's name. She stood tall, holding Mia, and walked to the front. "State your name," the judge said, her voice all business. "Elena Marsh, Your Honor." "And you are here asking for an emergency annulment of your marriage?" "Yes, ma'am," Elena said, her voice shaking just a little. "On what grounds?" Elena took a deep breath, and Jack could see her pull her courage around her like a shield. "On the grounds that I was tricked into the marriage, Your Honor, and because if I remain his wife, I truly believe he will end my life and my daughter's." A gasp went through the room. Marsh shot to his feet, but one of his lawyers yanked him back down. The judge's eyes narrowed on him. "Mr. Marsh, I assume." Robert stood, trying to look charming. "Yes, Your Honor, and these accusations are outrageous." "You will get your turn," Judge Miller said, her voice cutting like ice. "Sit down." He sat, his face turning red with fury. The judge turned back to Elena. "Mrs. Marsh, please, tell me what happened." And so, with her baby quiet in her arms, Elena began to speak. She told them about meeting Robert in St. Louis, about a whirlwind romance that felt like a dream. The judge listened, her face a stone mask, missing nothing. Then Elena's voice hardened as she reached the part where the dream became a nightmare. "The first time he hit me was 2 weeks after the wedding," she said. "He told me a wife does not need friends. When I argued, he struck me." Marsh jumped up again. "Your Honor, this is a lie." "Mr. Marsh," the judge boomed, "one more interruption and the sheriff will remove you. Now sit down and be silent." Robert sat, fuming. Elena didn't flinch. She continued, her voice growing stronger. "He cried after. He swore it would never happen again. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him, but it happened over and over. Always where the bruises would not show. Always followed by apologies and promises he never meant to keep." "Did you ever tell anyone?" the judge asked. "I went to a minister once," Elena said, her voice cracking. "He told me to be a more obedient wife. He told me to pray harder." She looked directly at the judge. "So I tried. I made myself smaller, quieter. It never mattered. Nothing I did was ever enough. It only got worse when I was expecting. Robert was furious when he found out I was having a girl. He said he needed a son. After Mia was born, the beatings became worse. He said I had failed him." Elena's testimony painted a clear, horrifying picture. When the lawyers tried to twist her words, Judge Miller saw right through them. In the end, the judge's decision was swift. She granted the annulment, declaring the marriage void. Then she looked straight at Robert Marsh. "This court finds your actions despicable," she said. "You are to have no contact with this woman or her child. If you come near them, I will have you thrown in a jail so deep you will forget what the sun looks like. Now get out of my sight." Humiliated and seething, Marsh stormed out. But Jack knew it was not over. Outside, as the sun began to set, Marsh made his final desperate move. He lunged for Elena, trying to grab the baby. But Jack was faster. He stepped between them, a wall of pure determination. Marsh's hired men took one look at Jack's cold eyes and the sheriff's hand on his gun, and they backed away. Their pay was not worth dying for. Defeated and alone, Robert Marsh was run out of town with a clear warning never to return. Standing in the quiet street, Elena looked at Jack, her eyes full of a gratitude that words could not express. The marriage certificate in her pocket was supposed to be a lie, a legal trick. But as Jack Rowan gently took her hand, she had a feeling it was the beginning of the truest thing she had ever known. When the midwife said we were having a girl, my husband Robert got madder than a wet hen. He told me I was useless, that I couldn't even give him the son he wanted. When our Mia was born, he looked at her like she was some kind of mistake, my mistake. And that's when he started getting real mean. Judge Miller leaned in close. Mrs. Marsh, you wrote here that you were afraid for your daughter's life. Can you tell the court why? Elena took a shaky breath. 2 weeks ago, Robert came home 3 sheets to the wind. He'd lost a pile of money on a bad deal and was looking for someone to take it out on. He hurt me worse than ever before. When Mia started crying in her cradle, he hollered at her to shut her mouth. But she's just a baby. She didn't understand. So he grabbed her and he threw her. Gasps filled the courtroom. Robert Marsh jumped to his feet, shouting that it was all lies. The judge's gavel cracked like a whip. Order! I will have order! She pointed a finger at Robert. Mr. Marsh, one more peep out of you and you'll be thrown out of here. Do you hear me? His face was beet red, but he nodded and sat back down. The judge turned back to Elena, her expression softening just a little. Mrs. Marsh, did your little girl make it? Yes, Your Honor. She hit the wall, and for a second, Elena's voice broke. Tears streamed down her face, but she pushed on. I thought she was gone, but then she started crying, and I knew I had to get her away from him for good. That night, after he passed out, I took what little cash I had stashed away and I ran. And he came after you? Yes, ma'am. He put up posters with rewards for anyone who found me. Somebody in a town called Dead Ridge saw me and sent word. He showed up with his men, and I barely got away. I just ran out into the open country with nowhere to go. If Mr. Rowan hadn't found us, me and Mia would have died out there. Judge Miller looked up from her notes. Dr. Hennessy, you checked her over when she got to Willow Creek? Yes, Your Honor. The doctor stood up. Can you tell us what you found? I did, Your Honor. She had bruises all over, old and new, which means this had been happening for a long time. She also had fresh injuries from a severe beating, broken ribs, bruises on her face, and wounds on her arms like she was trying to block the blows. In my medical opinion, someone had violently assaulted her. Thank you, Doctor. Judge Miller looked back at Elena. Mrs. Marsh, you're asking this court to cancel your marriage and allow you to marry Mr. Jack Rowan. Is that right? Yes, Your Honor. Why not just get a protection order? Elena glanced at Jack, then at Robert. Because my husband knows people, Your Honor. He's got money and power. A piece of paper won't stop him. He'll find a way around it. But if I'm married to another man, Robert has no legal claim on me or my daughter. It's the only way I can see to keep us safe. Mr. Rowan, please stand up. Jack stood, feeling the whole town's eyes on him. Judge Miller sized him up. Mr. Rowan, you know what you're getting into? You'd be taking on full responsibility for Mrs. Marsh and her child. You'd be going up against a man with a lot of influence. Yes, Your Honor, I do, and you are still willing to do it? Why? Jack had figured this question was coming. The truth was a tangled mess of loneliness and feeling useful for the first time in 20 years. It's the right thing to do, Your Honor, because Mrs. Marsh and her little girl deserve to be safe. And because I gave them my word. And how long have you known Mrs. Marsh? 4 days, Your Honor. A low murmur spread through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow. 4 days, and you're ready to get hitched? Yes, Your Honor. This ain't about romance. You're not in love with her? Jack looked the judge square in the eye. No, Your Honor. This is a practical answer to a dangerous problem. Mrs. Marsh needs legal protection, and a marriage gives her that. We both know exactly what this is. Judge Miller turned to Elena. Mrs. Marsh, is that how you see it? You understand this would be a marriage of convenience? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rowan has been very clear. He isn't asking for anything from me. He just wants to help keep me and my daughter safe. And you trust this man? Elena looked over at Jack, and for a moment it was like they were the only 2 people in the room. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Judge Miller leaned back in her chair, thinking hard. The silence stretched on. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Marsh's, lawyers, you can make your case now. The main lawyer stood up, a skinny fellow with spectacles who looked like he won most of the time. Your Honor, this is just plain ridiculous. My client's wife is clearly not in her right mind. She's making wild accusations with no proof. The doctor saw bruises, sure, but you can get bruises 100 different ways. She could have fallen down. Are you truly suggesting she did this to herself? The judge asked, her voice dangerously low. I'm suggesting there are other ways to explain it. As for what she said about the baby, there were no witnesses. It's her word against his. And we all know that new mothers can get confused, even a little crazy. It's a documented medical condition. Jack's hands balled into fists. The lawyer kept going. What's more, this marriage to Mr. Rowan is clearly a trick to cheat my client out of his rights as a husband and a father. Mr. Rowan himself said he's known her for only 4 days. No sensible person gets married that fast. This is a conspiracy to get around the law. A conspiracy to save her life, Jack said, his voice low and angry. Mr. Rowan, you will be silent, Judge Miller said, but she didn't sound too upset about it. She looked at the lawyer. Do you have any proof that Mrs. Marsh is mentally unstable? Any records from doctors who've seen her? We have my client's word about her strange behavior and how she couldn't keep a proper house. So no medical evidence, just what your client says. Judge Miller jotted down another note. Anything else? The lawyer pulled out a stack of papers. We have a motion to have Mrs. Marsh and the child returned to my client's care right away. We also have a court order from a judge in St. Louis giving Mr. Marsh emergency custody. He walked up and handed the papers to the judge. She read them, and her face got darker with every word. This order was signed 3 days ago, she said. It was signed before anyone investigated, before Mrs. Marsh got to tell her side of the story. The judge who signed this is a Harold Peaton, is that right? Yes, Your Honor. And Judge Peaton is a personal friend of the Marsh family, isn't he? The lawyer cleared his throat. I believe they know each other. Yes, they know each other, Judge Miller said, her voice dripping with scorn. Mr. Marsh, please stand. Robert stood up, trying to look calm and important. Mr. Marsh, did you talk to Judge Peaton before he signed this order? I might have mentioned the situation to him. We go to the same club in St. Louis. I see. And did you tell Judge Peaton about the abuse? Did you tell him what your wife was saying? There is no abuse, Your Honor. There's just a crazy woman making up stories to run out on her husband and child. Run out on the child? Judge Miller's eyebrows shot up. The child is right here with her mother, Mr. Marsh. Robert's calm finally cracked. I misspoke, Your Honor. I meant she ran out on her duties. No, I think you told the truth for once. You said child, not children, like the baby is just a piece of property to be taken back. Judge Miller put the papers down. Here is what I see, Mr. Marsh. I see a rich man using his buddies to get a court order without following the law. A woman running for her life is unstable. I see a whole lot of things, but no real proof that you're a fit parent. Your Honor, I must object, the lawyer started. Object all you want. That court order from your client's friend, Judge Peaton, holds no water in this territory. I'm the judge here, and I'll make my decision based on what I see in this courtroom. She then looked straight at Elena. Mrs. Marsh, please stand up again. Elena stood, holding Mia close. I'm going to ask you a question. I need you to be completely honest. Can you do that? Yes, Your Honor. If I deny your request, if I order you to go back to your husband, what will you do? Elena's voice was clear and steady. I will run again, Your Honor. I will take my daughter, and I will keep running until he catches me or I die. Going back to him is a death sentence. And I won't let my daughter think that's what love is. Her raw honesty filled the room with silence. Judge Miller nodded. That's what I thought you'd say. She then turned to Robert. Mr. Marsh, I ask you the same. If I grant this and recognize a new marriage, what will you do? Robert's face was like stone. I will appeal, Your Honor. I will fight this injustice with every legal tool I have. My wife belongs with me, and I will not stop until she is returned to her proper place. Her proper place. An interesting choice of words. Judge Miller stood up. I've heard enough. I am taking a 1-hour recess to think on my ruling. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell and the room buzzed with talk. Jack went right to Elena, who was shaking despite her brave words. "You did good," he said softly. "I don't know if it's enough. Did you see his face? He's going to fight this with everything he has. Let him fight. We'll be ready for it." Sheriff Brennan walked over, his face grim. "That court order he's waving around is still a problem. Even if the judge rules for you, Marsh can use it to cause trouble." "Can he undo her ruling?" Jack asked. "Not easy, but he can tie things up in knots for months, file appeals, make it all complicated." Brennan lowered his voice. "And every single day this drags on is another day he's looking for a way to take them back by force in his favor." They waited in a small room off to the side where Doc Hennessy and Sarah held a fussy Mia. The baby could feel the tension. "What do you think she'll decide?" Elena asked, her eyes fixed on Brennan. "It is hard to tell," he admitted. "Judge Miller is a fair woman, but she is practical. She knows this annulment will stir up a hornet's nest, especially if Marsh calls in favors from his powerful friends." Brennan paused. "But she has also seen what men like him do to their wives. She knows the truth when she hears it, and she does not take kindly to being strong-armed." The next hour crawled by. Elena paced the floorboards raw, while Jack stood guard at the window watching the street. At last, the clerk opened the door. "Judge Miller is ready for you." They filed back into a courtroom that was now packed solid. It seemed half of Willow Creek had turned out to see justice done. Jack spotted the blacksmith and several ranchers he knew, their faces set and serious, everyone's eyes on her. "I have considered all the testimony presented here today," she began, her voice filling the silent room. "This is not a simple matter. The law is not always built for times when common decency clashes with legal paperwork. But it is my duty to see that the law serves justice." Jack felt Elena's small hand find his, and he gave it a gentle squeeze. "Mrs. Elena Marsh has provided a believable account of abuse at the hands of her husband, Robert Marsh. This is backed up by medical facts and the simple truth that she ran for her life across hard country to escape him. A woman does not risk dying in the wilderness unless she is running from something far worse." Robert Marsh sat rigid, his jaw clenched tight. Mr. Robert Marsh, however, has provided a court order from a judge with close family ties. He offered no believable reason for his wife's condition, and no proof of her being unstable besides his own claims. "It seems to me a man who truly cared for his family would be grateful to find them alive. Mr. Marsh seems more concerned with reclaiming his property than reuniting with his wife and child." Robert's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I object." "Sit down," Judge Miller commanded without looking at him. "I am not finished." The lawyer fell back into his chair. "Based on the evidence, I am granting Mrs. Elena Marsh's request to annul her marriage to Robert Marsh. The marriage is officially over, starting right now." Elena let out a sharp breath, her grip tightening on Jack's hand. The judge continued. "Furthermore, Miss Elena Marsh is granted temporary protective custody of her child, Mia Marsh. Mr. Robert Marsh is ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from Elena Marsh and her daughter. If you violate this order, you will be arrested on the spot." Robert shot up from his chair. "This is an outrage. You can't do this." "I have every right, Mr. Marsh. This is my court, and this is my ruling. If you have a problem with it, take it to the Territorial Supreme Court. Until then, you will obey my order, or you will see the inside of my jail." The judge then turned her gaze to Jack. "Mr. Rowan, you asked to marry Miss Marsh if the annulment was granted. Is that still what you want to do?" "Yes, Your Honor, it is." "And Miss Marsh, you agree to this marriage of your own free will?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then, by the power given to me, I recognize the marriage of Jack Rowan and Elena Marsh, effective this very moment." Jack turned to Elena. Her face was wet with tears. He had not prepared any words, but looking at her now, they came to him. "I promise to protect you and Mia with my life. I promise to give you the time you need to heal. I will ask for nothing. but the chance to earn your trust." He softened his voice. "And I promise you will never have to run again." Elena wiped her eyes. "I promise to trust you when I can, and to try when it feels impossible. I promise to let you help us." Her voice trembled. "And I promise that one day I will be strong enough to stand by myself. But until then, I will let you stand with me." Judge Miller's stern face softened just a little. "Then I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Rowan, you may kiss your bride." Jack looked at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny nod. He leaned down and placed the softest kiss on her forehead. It was a promise, not a claim. The courtroom burst into applause, but Jack's eyes were locked on Robert Marsh, whose face was pale with fury. As his lawyers hurried him out, Robert stopped right beside them. He leaned in, his voice a hateful whisper only they could hear. "This is not over. You think this paper changes anything? You will pay for this." Sheriff Brennan was suddenly at Robert's side, his hand resting near his pistol. "Mr. Marsh, you are violating a court order. I suggest you leave this courtroom now. You have until sundown to be out of Willow Creek." Robert's eyes burned with hate, but he turned and stalked out, his men right behind him. The door slammed shut, rattling the windows. Judge Miller looked at the new couple. "I meant what I said about that protective order. He comes near you, you have him arrested." She looked directly at Jack. "And Mr. Rowan, you take care of your new family. I have a feeling you're going to need to." Outside, the townsfolk surrounded them with words of support. The blacksmith clapped Jack's shoulder while a shopkeeper's wife pressed a jar of homemade jam into Elena's hands. They were not alone. The attention felt strange. For a man who'd spent years being invisible, it was a lot to take in. Dr. Hennessy walked up beside him. "You gave this town hope, Jack. Seeing you stand for Elena and Mia meant something." Jack just nodded. "It is what anyone ought to do." The doctor smiled. "That is why it means so much. Now get your family home before they are worn out." Your family. The words felt like a new pair of boots that needed breaking in. He looked at Elena and Mia asleep in Sarah's arms, and the truth of it hit him hard. He was a husband and a father. After 34 years alone, he was now the man two people counted on. It was a heavy thought, but underneath the worry was a solid feeling of purpose. He had finally stopped running. As they walked home with the sun going down, surrounded by friendly faces, he heard horses thundering away. Robert and his crew were gone, just like the judge ordered. But Jack knew a man like Robert Marsh, shamed in front of the whole town, would not let it go. Men like that do not just walk away. They wait for their chance to get even. Jack would be waiting too. He had made promises he aimed to keep, no matter the price. 3 days later, in that quiet time just before sunrise, the smell of smoke woke him up. It was the wrong kind of smoke. He was up in a second, gun in hand, moving quiet as a shadow through the house. Looking out the window, he saw it. A growing orange glow coming from the livery stable. Fire. He did not even grab his boots, just ran out into the street, yelling, "Fire! Fire!" At the livery. Lights started flicking on as men ran from their houses toward the blaze. The old livery was going up like a tinderbox, and the sound of terrified horses came from inside. The heat pushed Jack back, but he saw the problem right away. The main door was chained shut from the outside, with a padlock glinting in the flames. This was no accident. Sheriff Brennan was right there, coughing. "We need bolt cutters for that chain." "No time!" Jack shouted. He soaked his shirt in a nearby water trough, covered his face, and slammed his whole body against the door. He hit it again and again until the heat-weakened wood finally gave way. 6 panicked horses charged out into the night, nearly running him down. Men scrambled to catch them. "Is that all of them?" Brennan yelled above the fire. "I think so," Jack coughed, backing away from the inferno. The barn was a lost cause. Everyone formed a bucket line from the well to keep the fire from spreading. As he passed buckets, Jack's mind was clear. The locked chain meant this was a warning from Robert Marsh. It took 2 hours to get the blaze under control. By sunup, the livery was just a smoking ruin. The horses were safe, but the message had been delivered. Jack found Sheriff Brennan staring at the wreckage. "This was Marsh," Jack stated. "I cannot prove it," Brennan said, kicking a burnt plank. "He rode out of town 3 days back, but he could have paid someone to do his dirty work." "So what now?" Jack asked. The sheriff looked him square in the eye. "Now you watch your back. You protect your family. This is only the beginning." Jack headed back to the doctor's house to find Elena woke up shaking, clutching baby Mia to her chest. The bitter smell of smoke was a terrible reminder of the night's fire. She knew deep down who was to blame. This was Robert's doing, wasn't it? He was trying to scare them. Jack's voice was grim. "He is trying to scare me. He wants me to know he can still get to the people I care about." The thought of running crossed Elena's mind, but Jack knew better. A man like that will not stop hunting you just because you find a new place to hide. He told her they had to stand their ground and fight. To his surprise, Elena's fear turned into resolve. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Jack knew right then they had a real chance. They had to build a family so strong in the eyes of the law that no one could ever tear it apart. "I want to adopt Mia," Jack said, plain and simple. "I want to make her my daughter legally." Elena looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. But would a judge even consider it? Jack explained that with the danger they were in, Judge Miller just might. But he needed her to understand something important. "This is not just a legal move, Elena. If I adopt this little girl, I am her father for the rest of my life. I need to know that is what you want." Elena looked down at Mia, this tiny soul who had already been through so much. Then she looked back at Jack, her eyes full of a trust that humbled him. "You already care for her like she is your own." She reached out and took his hand. "Yes, I want you to adopt her. I want her to have a father who will protect her and show her that men can be good. I want her to have you." Hearing those words, a wall that Jack had built around his heart 20 years ago finally began to crumble. He felt a love and responsibility he thought he had lost forever. He knew what he had to do next. He went straight to Sheriff Brennan. It did not take long to track down the man who set the fire. The fool got drunk at the saloon and bragged all over town about the $200 Robert Marsh had paid him for the job. By evening, the sheriff had a full confession written down and signed. Marsh told him to set the fire as a warning, making sure no one got hurt. But the lock on the stable door told a much darker story. "This is proof," Brennan said, laying the signed confession on his desk. "It shows Marsh is a criminal. Jack had an idea. I want to send him a copy of this. Let him know we have proof. Let him understand that if he keeps pushing us, we will use it to ruin everything he has built." Brennan warned him it was like poking a rattlesnake with a short stick. "A cornered man is a dangerous man." "He is already dangerous," Jack replied. "At least this way he knows what it will cost him." The sheriff finally nodded. He agreed to send a copy to Marsh's address in St. Louis along with the arrest warrant. A couple of weeks later, Judge Miller returned to town. She listened to their story, looked over the proof of Robert's cruelty, and granted the adoption without a second thought. "Mr. Rowan, you are now the legal father of Mia Rowan," she said with a warm smile. "That child is mighty lucky to have you." Walking out of that courthouse holding his daughter, Jack felt the true weight of that moment. He was a father by choice. A few days later, a letter came from Robert Marsh's lawyer. It was cold and formal, stating that Mr. Marsh was dropping all legal claims. He was giving up. "Why?" Elena asked, reading the letter over his shoulder. "After everything he did, why would he just surrender?" Sheriff Brennan stopped by that afternoon with the answer, wearing a grin you could see from a mile away. "It seems Marsh's political dreams have gone up in smoke," Brennan said. "Someone leaked that arson confession to the newspapers back in St. Louis. The story is everywhere. His powerful friends have turned their backs on him, and his business partners are cutting ties." When Jack asked who could have leaked it, the sheriff's eyes twinkled. "Well, I hear Judge Catherine Miller has friends in the newspaper business. and she has never been fond of powerful men who abuse their wives. After the sheriff left, the relief finally washed over Elena. She broke down in tears, not of fear, but of freedom. Jack held her and Mia close, the three of them standing together as the weight of the past finally lifted. "You gave us a future," she whispered. In the quiet weeks that followed, they learned Marsh had moved to California to start over. He was gone. Jack took a job at the rebuilt livery stable, and as summer turned to fall, their new life began. They were safe, they were together, and for the first time in a very long time, they were at peace. And the owner needed some help. The work was hard but honest, and it put food on the table for his family. That word, family, was starting to feel right. Elena was healing too. The bruises on her skin were gone, but the ones on the inside took their own sweet time. She still had nightmares about Robert, but they came less often. She began to smile again and look at Jack in a new way. He would catch her watching him as he played with Mia, a softness in her eyes. But he never pushed it. Their marriage was a deal made for safety. If it was to become something more, that had to be her choice. 3 months after they had stood before the judge, she found him mending a fence. "Can we talk?" she asked. He put down his hammer. "We sure can." They sat together on the porch steps, and he kept a ways off. The fall sun felt good, and inside the house, little Mia was sleeping safe and sound, with Sarah Hennessy keeping an eye on her. Elena folded her hands in her lap. "Jack, I've been thinking about this deal we made," she started. "About this marriage, and what it all means." Jack felt his gut clench up. "All right." "When we got hitched, it was for protection, just a plan to keep me and Mia safe. You were plain about that, and I was grateful. You didn't try to dress it up as something it wasn't." She gave a small smile. "But things have a way of changing. People do, too. I've changed, Jack. That woman you married 3 months ago was scared to death and broken. She figured she could never trust a man again. But the woman I am today..." She trailed off, looking for the right words. "The woman I am today sees everything you've done for us. Not just keeping us safe, but your patience. How you gave me room to heal, but were always nearby. The way you love Mia and ask for nothing back. How you've treated me like a real person, not just something to be owned." Jack held his breath, waiting. "I'm not saying I'm ready for everything a true marriage is," Elena said, her voice sure. "I don't know when I'll be ready for that, but I want to try. I want to see if we can make something real out of this, if you're willing." "Elena," his voice came out all gravelly. He cleared his throat. "You don't owe me that. I didn't marry you expecting anything to change." "I know, and that's exactly why I want to try." She reached out and took his hand. It was a new feeling, a little unsure but honest. "You've shown me what a good man is, Jack. What a partnership can be instead of just being owned. I'd like to see where that goes, if you would." Jack looked down at their hands, then at this woman who'd been through so much and still found the nerve to hope again. He felt something inside him settle down, something that had been jumpy and lost for as long as he could remember. "I'd like that," he said, plain and simple. "More than you'll ever know." They just sat there in the autumn light, holding hands, while Mia's baby noises floated out the window. The future was still a mystery, but for the first time, it didn't feel so scary. Time moved on, and the seasons turned. Winter hit the Dakota Territory with its usual bite, but the little house stayed warm. Jack kept the stove fed, and Mia grew, reaching for things with her chubby little hands. Elena started teaching at the town schoolhouse, putting her education to good use, and Jack found out something he never figured on. He was a natural at being a father, not a perfect one, mind you, but he was always there. When Mia cried in the night, he got up. When Elena was worn out from teaching, he took the baby without a word. This little family life just started to feel right. He and Elena got closer, taking it slow, building trust one day at a time. She told him about her dreams before Robert had tried to stomp them out. He told her about the war and the real reason he got court-martialed. He'd refused a direct order to burn down a farmhouse that had a family hiding inside. "You were wrong," Elena told him one night by the fire with Mia asleep nearby, "about not deserving to put down roots. You always deserved 'em. You just needed to find the right patch of ground." "You think Willow Creek, is it?" "I think home isn't a place, Jack. It's people. And you and Mia. Y'all are my home now." He kissed her then. It was a gentle kiss, giving her plenty of time to pull away. She didn't. She leaned right into it, her hand coming up to his cheek. It was sweet and new. This was a choice. This was real. Spring came, and with it, a letter from St. Louis. Robert. Marsh was dead out in California. Got thrown from his horse during a drunken ride. The law said it was just bad luck. A man making one last bad choice. The letter from his lawyer had papers that cut the last legal tie between them. Elena read the letter twice. Then she folded it up neat and set it on the table. "How you feeling?" Jack asked, watching her close. "I don't rightly know," she said. "He was my husband once. Even if it was a nightmare, you'd think I'd feel something. But mostly I just feel—" She thought for a second. "Free. Finally and completely free. He can't hurt us anymore. It's truly over." It was over the day Judge Miller signed those papers. In my head it was. But my heart needed this. It needed to know he couldn't just change his mind or find some new way to get at us. Elena looked right at Jack, her eyes clear as a bell. Now my heart knows it too. That summer, they got married all over again. This time it wasn't for protection, it was for love. It was a small service at the church, but half the town showed up. Mia, who was a year old and walking a little wobbly, was the flower girl. Sheriff Brennan stood up as Jack's best man, and Judge Miller herself officiated. "I've married a lot of folks in my day," the judge said after, "but I've never seen two people fight harder for the right to be together. May your future be everything you've earned." The years went by, full of good times and hard times. Jack and Elena had two more children, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Sarah. Mia grew up strong and sure of herself, never knowing the kind of fear her mother had lived with. Elena became the head teacher at the school, and Jack bought the livery stable and made it a success. They built a real house on some land outside of town with plenty of room for their family. But they built something more important than all that. They built a partnership, a marriage where each respected the other. They argued sometimes, sure, but they always fought fair. Jack never raised a hand or even his voice in anger. And Elena learned, slow but sure, that love didn't have to hurt and that her voice mattered. On Mia's 10th birthday, Elena pulled Jack aside. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked him. "Out on the prairie when you heard Mia crying and you stopped." "Sometimes. Why?" "I think about all the men who must have ridden right past before you came along. Heard a baby crying out in the middle of nowhere and just decided it wasn't their problem." She took his hand in hers. "But you stopped. You chose to care. And that one choice changed everything for us." Jack looked over at their children laughing and playing. "I heard her crying," he said. "I couldn't just leave her. That's all it was." "No," Elena said, her voice soft. "That's everything. That's the difference between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. It's the people who hear trouble and choose to stop instead of just riding on past." She kissed him. Through the window they could see Mia showing her little brother and sister how to play some game she'd made up. The little girl who'd once been thrown against a wall was now teaching her own family about gentleness and love, the same hard lessons she had. Years passed. Jack was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, when a young woman came to Willow Creek looking for him. She was maybe 20 years old, dressed sharp like a city lawyer, and had dark blue eyes that tugged at his memory. "Mr. Rowan," she said, finding him at the feed store. "My name is Catherine Marsh. I do believe you knew my father, Robert Marsh. Jack's hand twitched, reaching for the ghost of a pistol on his hip. I knew him. I'm not here for trouble, she said, seeing his look. I came to thank you. When my father passed, I received his papers. In them was a letter to you he never mailed. He confessed it all in that letter. The meanness, the bruises, the lies he told. Her voice cracked just a bit. He wrote that losing Elena and Mia was the only thing that made him see the monster he'd become. Watching you stand for them when all he'd ever done was hurt them showed him what a man was supposed to be. He knew he couldn't fix what he'd broken, but he prayed they found a good life with you. Jack stood there, the words settling on him like dust. Why are you telling me this? Because I needed you to know some good came out of all that hurt. My father's letter was my only inheritance, not his money, but his truth. It set me free from all the tall tales he spun about my mother. It gave me the real story. Catherine's eyes welled up. And it made me want to be a better person than he was. I'm a lawyer now, Mr. Rowan. Because of you, I help women get away from men like him. Because you fought for Elena. My life has a purpose. She stayed for an hour, meeting Elena and Mia, and listening to them tell their side of things. As he watched her ride off, Jack felt the final page of that dark chapter turn for good. You reckon he really changed? Elena asked him that night. I don't know, Jack said. Maybe at the very end. Or maybe it was just one last trick. Does it matter now? He thought on it a second. No. What matters is that you're safe. Mia's safe. We built a good life out of a bad mess. On Jack's 60th birthday, his whole family gathered around. His kids, and his grandkids too, since Mia had married a good man and had 3 little ones of her own. Looking at all those faces around the big dinner table, Jack thought about the man he'd been 30 years ago. Just a drifter, heading to Willow Creek for a paycheck, already planning to move on. He'd believed he wasn't the kind of man worth staying for. He was wrong. He just needed to hear a baby crying in the wilderness to find that out. Mia stood up and raised her glass. To my father, she said, her voice clear and strong, who heard me crying when I needed him most and never stopped listening. Every good thing in my life started the day you chose to stop instead of riding on by. Thank you for choosing us. Jack lifted his own glass, a lump in his throat he didn't bother to hide anymore. His family echoed the toast around him. He finally understood that this right here, this love and this belonging was worth every hard mile that brought him to this place. The sound of mercy wasn't just a baby's cry on the wind. It was the echo of that one choice, moving through the years, changing lives, and proving that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is just stop and care. And Jack Rowan, who had spent half his life running, had finally found his place. Not because it was perfect, but because he'd built it himself, with his own hands and his own heart, one good choice at a time, until riding past just wasn't an option anymore. He was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.